Hello and welcome to our first in a series of 3 videos as part of our Climate Crisis Challenge campaign. As part of the series, we will be sitting down with experts from each of our supporting partners. My name is Labiak, Chief Investigative Reporter at Property Week, and I'm delighted to be joined by Claire Bradbury, Senior Consultant at Carbon Intelligence. Welcome, Claire.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
Today, we will be talking about the connection between social value and tackling climate change, investigating how real estate businesses need to consider the wider impact that implementing policies designed to tackle the climate crisis can have on the wider community. So, to start with, Claire, what do we mean by social value?
Well, social value really refers to the network of benefits or value add, if you like, that is conferred on stakeholders by the built environment. So when we're talking about social value, we're really talking about environmental, social and economic well-being. And I think it's really important to say from the outset that we're not just talking about the S in ES&G. It's much broader than that, and we're looking at quality of life overall, really. So when we're considering social value, the stakeholders might change depending on the asset, depending on the location, for example. But what we're seeing more and more is the need to and the appetite to include stakeholders beyond just building occupiers or building users, and actually opening this out to the community. And the most crucial thing about social value is the fact that it is about outcomes. So we're really interested in the change that is precipitated as a result of an asset. So that has to be measurable, obviously. And when we're talking about being measurable, it's not necessarily reducing it to pounds and pence, but we're looking for really targeted, robust KPIs that can chart the progress or the change in quality of life in stakeholders over time.
Okay. So why should you incorporate a social value, a strategy which bears in mind that wider community piece? Why should we incorporate a social value program into a net zero carbon strategy for a real estate portfolio? Where's the connection there?
Well, the connection is, net zero necessarily requires a portfolio-led approach, and social value, the principles for applying a social value program are very similar. So first and foremost, for fund and asset managers, it's social value gives us a much more compelling conversation to have with our investors, who are increasingly seeing we're increasingly seeing their appetite to look behind data and look for meaningful change. And secondly, commercial real estate is fundamentally about strategic programs of land that shape our connection with people, and they shape our connection with place for the mid to long term. So at the most fundamental level, as with net zero pathways, social value is about de-risking our assets and about increasing their resilience. And what we've seen, certainly what we're seeing more recently, is the absolutely inextricable connection between the resilience of built assets with human resilience as well, and with environmental resilience. And if we take one example, say green and blue infrastructure, which really simply just means our natural assets. So our watercourses, our hedgerows, parks, woodlands, that kind of thing. If we protect them or restore them or enhance them, they are going to be able to alleviate flood risk, for instance. They're going to sequester carbon. They will help to reduce things like urban heat island effect. And they provide critical habitat for wildlife. So not only then are we equipping our physical assets with far greater resilience to these extreme events that we're seeing as a result of accelerating climate emergency, but we're also making the physical environment much more habitable for the people surrounding or interacting with the built assets.
So you talked a bit about almost some theoretical examples there. Are there any examples in the real world, specific projects or specific portfolios whereby developers or landlords have done this? They've made that connection between reaching a net zero target and implementing social value.
Look, it's a really good question. I mean, social value has been, I think, obfuscated for quite a long time because the language of it is it's not necessarily complex, but it can be quite confusing. And best practice in this area is very much emergent, so it's in its nascent stages. But what we are seeing is that best practice from a fund manager and an asset manager perspective looks like taking a portfolio-led approach to this. And we are starting to see, certainly some of our clients, our large landowners and investors, taking a much more macro level view of the assets. So pulling back, and rather than looking individually at asset by asset, they're developing a much bigger strategy that means they're able to see at a landscape level where are the stresses in the portfolio, what are the key drivers surrounding particular assets or particular clusters of assets, and then what enablers they can actually look at to affect change. And so once we have this broader strategy, it's then being applied on an individual asset basis. So the best practice really now is looking like this thinking globally, but then delivering locally, because of course there are nuances depending on the type of asset and where it's located and so on. So if we narrow down the focus to individual assets, which has been the tendency up until fairly recently, we run the risk of narrowing our focus. It also means that ambition and innovation, or opportunities to access innovation, can be stymied, really, because we don't have that landscape view. And then lastly, one of the most important things about this is measurability, and for that we need data, and we need data that reflects an accurate picture across groups of assets, and that is much harder to achieve when we just look at it on an individual level. And I think in this, another important thing to say is that contextually, when we're talking about commercial real estate, we are most of the time talking about urban environments. And we know that cities are going to be under ever-increasing stress in the years to come. By 2050, the projection is still that some 2/3 of the global population is globalized, so is urbanized. Sorry, and so it's really important then that we're thinking about how do we maximize the dollar for dollar spend on social value programs, and the best programs are those that recognize that there's a multiplier effect. So we're not just looking in silos, but we're looking for these co-beneficial solutions.
I just wanted to pick up on one of the things you were talking about that thinking globally and also thinking locally, kind of almost at the same time. Is that something, because it almost seems like a contradiction, is that something that you think companies sometimes struggle with, perhaps?
Yeah, I think absolutely, and I think that can get in the way often of just getting started, because we try and start with a perfect product, a perfect strategy, when a lot of the time this is quite it's an iterative process. So I think that's one of the key lessons, really, is to not let that get in the way. But having a central strategy is an important starting point, because it will align directly with the values of the particular asset manager. But then we have to recognise that there are these subtle differences in the communities that we're operating in, for instance, and what is a priority for one community won't necessarily be material to another. And so we have to almost come at it from both ends, really. And to do that, we need really clear lines of communication between that central function and also asset level function as well.
Mm. How important is innovation to all of this? And are there any examples you can think of an especially innovative approach, someone who did something quite interesting in this area?
Yeah, absolutely. Innovation is central, and what it means for social value is fundamentally this recognition of the link between climate resilience and equitable, just, inclusive futures. And that's where we're really seeing innovation in this space. We've got the one of our most disruptive examples that I can cite is Project Utopia, which has really shown the appetite to turn real estate, and particularly at the moment focusing on residential real estate, but to really turn it on its head. And the company was founded by Joseph Daniels, who set out really to solve the housing crisis by treating it as it should be treated, which is fundamentally it's an environmental and a social crisis. And what's so interesting about Utopia is that they've really harnessed a build that links technology with energy and with construction to make buildings that can be built very, very quickly. They are flood resistant, they're hurricane proof, they produce more energy than they consume, they're scalable, and they're affordable as well. So while this is an example that sits in the residential space largely, there are huge lessons that the commercial real estate sector can learn from this, because this is where we are going to see the most disruption, especially with the net zero ambition. So we can see much more of it.
What can, on some lessons then that commercial real estate can take away from this, because it's, with that residential scheme that you outlined, almost the social value side of it is there, and the affordability, as you mentioned, and then the net zero side of it is there, and its energy efficiency. So how does an office building, how does that have an equivalent impact if they're not going to be, an office building won't be providing homes for people, because that's not the nature of that building. How does it then have a similar impact on a community?
Yeah, well, look, just because commercial real estate is largely geared up for offices, as you say, but we have lots of different stakeholder groups that interact with particular buildings. So beyond just being occupiers, we tend to be looking after employees. So well-being of employees, not to mention productivity, is absolutely business critical. And then coming outside of the building, as I mentioned before, so much of what we're talking about is a strategic program of land that shapes our interaction with other people and with places. And so they have a material contribution to things like social connectivity and environmental resilience. So we need to make sure that we are not just narrowly focusing in on the occupier piece, but we're willing to look beyond that. We can look even further if we go into the supply chain and think about building materials, for instance, because of course behind all of our building materials are the people manufacturing them. So we can look very deeply at human rights as well, further up the chain. But of course, how we focus this will very much depend on the appetite of the fund manager at large.
Are there any sort of times where these two aims, because there are lots of examples, I'm sure, of where these two aims complement each other, but just to take the supply chain example, examples where perhaps the social value, so the human rights of producing, elements of the supply chain is quite good, but then maybe on the sustainability side not so good. So do real estate companies run into these problems, and how do they manage them in your experience?
They absolutely do run into the problems. I would say the first thing that we tend to see as a response is taking this kind of balanced scorecard type approach. But what we do see is that we tend to run into the problems because we look at them quite far down the process. And what we really need to be doing is considering social value up front with when we now consider a net zero carbon pathway as well. And if we do that, we see that the decisions do have much more alignment, because we're looking at things like circularity of materials and different design strategies that are fundamentally better for human and planetary health, not to mention building health as well. And one really inspiring way that we're looking at this now is through the collaboration within the industry. So the Better Places Toolkit, which is in development at the moment, is one example of a first mover industry-led collaborative project to quantify social value outcomes throughout the asset life cycle. So we haven't seen that before. And as I said, in development at the moment, but when it is complete, the aim is that this will then assist the planning and the strategic operation and management of large programs of land.
So how far away do you think we are to this becoming more mainstream then than it is?
I think we're probably a couple of years off it becoming mainstream, but we are already seeing huge investors taking big steps towards this. So now is the time for that first mover advantage, and to really look for partners that can assist in delivering this and executing it in a strategic way. And I think that we need to be really conscious that nobody is on their own in this space. We definitely don't need to keep reinventing the wheel. There's plenty of knowledge out there, and the collaboration and the knowledge sharing is going to be a really critical part of catalysing this and scaling it up.
Yeah. So because that's something which I'm always interested in, is because obviously it's in any sector, the nature of it is competition. So how willing do you think companies are at the moment to share these ideas when, ostensibly, it's all the same planet and we're all in this together, but also they are businesses in competition with each other. So how likely are they, and what is the appetite like for that knowledge sharing?
Well, everybody needs the knowledge, so appetite is big. We
they might be big to have the knowledge, but maybe not to share it with someone else.
No, absolutely. But I think it certainly stands to reason that sharing knowledge, especially when we're so early on in this process, is absolutely critical. And all that facilitates, or all it will facilitate, is a kind of race to the top, which is the type of race that we actually want to see. I think that the built environment is incredibly collaborative, actually, and we're seeing more and more willingness to share case studies, but not just that, also to engage the supply chain and the broader value chain as well. That is a really critical piece too, and is absolutely happening. So, yes, there is certainly an element of competition, but quite simply, if we want to avoid the similar pitfalls that happen or would happen as a result of a failure to decarbonise, like reduced footfall, loss of premium tenants, lower valuation, lower productivity for occupiers within buildings, then getting heads together and sharing learnings, even sharing some of the failures as well, is really important.
Well, thank you very much, Claire, for joining us, and thank you for joining us as well. Join us next time when we'll be speaking with another supporting partner in our Climate Crisis Challenge campaign. Until then, thank you very much.